Right, now it's time to move on to our next talk. I'm going to be giving this one, and this is actually a really old talk. I guess it's not that old, it's 2 years old. But as you can see, it's got lots of old, outdated assets from the game since, we've been doing lots of revision on that. So hopefully everything else should still apply, but I might point out some funny things that are still in there from before. So anyone that's just now tuning in, we are doing some Microtalks today just about different parts of the game. Earlier we had Joe talking about some of the AI in our game, which is I'm really excited about because I think it's really going to make the dogs and the other people in the game a lot more exciting sort of individual entities and have a lot more interesting interactions. But the talk I'm going to be giving right now is a little bit more about the design of the game and about, maybe some lessons for some other games as well. And I'm going to be talking mostly about distance and empathy and sort of where we landed in terms of why the perspective in the game is what it is and why we have certain content in there or not. So to get started, To the Rescue, if you're watching this, you probably already know what To the Rescue is, and you've probably seen a much nicer version than it is here in these screenshots. But while working on it, early on we had some particular design issues that we had to find the sort of middle ground with. But in this game, really, some people might brand it as a quote-unquote empathy game, but I'm not really going to be talking about what those are or why we should be making them, but I'm going to zoom in a little bit and talk about things relevant to that have been really important for us while developing the game. So, as you know, it's a dog shelter simulator, and we started working on this game with the intention to have a fun experience that doesn't just encourage people to adopt shelter animals and let them know what the sort of conditions of shelter are like, but it also shows them some of the harsher realities. So in other words, we're trying to make a game that encourages empathy and also creates awareness. And there's some pitfalls in making a game like this. Excuse my really goofy graphics that I had on here. But essentially, we're trying to find a middle ground between making people sad, feeling preachy, and coming off as really edgy. That was sort of something three states we were trying to avoid with this game. Because some of the things in this game, it's easy to tell people that they should care about something, but that's a good way to make them not want to care about the thing. And we're also not wanting to traumatize people or have a game that does, graphic content just to make people uncomfortable. Those are all things that we've been trying to avoid. Especially because nobody wants to euthanize dogs. Nobody wants to ever have to do that, and that's something that we've been really well aware of while making this game. But it's also really important for us to represent the sort of shelter conditions that leads to something like that. And so if we're going to do this, we really need to try and do it the right way. So we want to make a game that creates empathy for dog shelters and shelter dogs, stays within people's comfort zones, but also still is fun. And doing all those three things is a bit of a challenge. And my usual first step when thinking about design problems is to look at other games that might have faced similar issues. So here's some of the games that we thought about early on in the design process and thinking about two things. First is, what decisions did they make and how to make empathy in their games? And how did they make me feel as a result? So first, here's Prison Architect, one of our really big inspirations for the game, for comical, if not pretty obvious reasons. It's a similar game in terms of genre and mechanics. And as it turns out, there's a lot of similarities with running a dog shelter and a prison. And though this game is more about designing the physical structure of the prison and making sure prisoners have access to their material needs, but those are all things that we're actually doing now too. It's not really framed as an empathy game at all, but it does tell you, it does have some interesting narrative points there. So like, for example, the CEO tells you what you need to build and why, and there's things that they tell you to do that have moral ambiguity. And so there's a little bit of commentary in there about just the prison system in general. But what's really interesting about that to me is that each prisoner has their own individual background. They have family and they have, things that they've done, which may or may not be, they may or may not be guilty of. And in a game just about building structures, there's a lot of characterization for each prisoner that does more than just go into how they interact with one another. But it might be easier to be cruel to criminals than to dogs for some audiences, so when some prisoners, even when they're questionably guilty, but most of that stuff in the game is all in the background and optional to even know about. The game isn't about making players aware of privatized prisons. It's about building stuff, and it has that in it, and it's fun. Another game we looked at is Frostpunk. And sorry if I'm talking too quickly. This talk is normally like a 20-minute talk, so I'm trying to shorten it a little bit. Now I'm going really fast. We also looked at Frostpunk, which is another simulation game that is designed to sort of pull on people's heartstrings and be sort of dark, but still be an interesting and challenging management game. You have to build a settlement in a very extreme survival situation, and your goal is mostly to make sure that some of your citizens survive, and it's incredibly bleak. And one thing we learned for this game is, while playing it, is that it does a lot to sort of show you the individual consequences of your actions, but they still never, to me at least, felt like they were much more than pawns that were walking around doing things, and it really prioritized the greater good over the one-on-one interaction a vast majority of the time. Even though it was heart-wrenching to really think about the consequences, I usually ended up choosing the most greater good options 100% of the time, just because I was in charge of creating the settlement, not in charge of the people, and this zoomed out level really did a lot to sort of emphasize that. But it's still a really great game, but I do feel like if you were any closer and you got to see more of the actual individual consequences of your actions, it would be a much, much more difficult game to play. So I think it was a great choice for this game. But it's interesting that that level of distance created that sort of disconnect for me. Another game we looked at was Papers, Please. I'm trying to find another sort of empathy-driven sim game. It does a great job of branching, engaging gameplay, and it has a very serious narrative, and it's got a lot of recognition for it, rightfully so. But really, on the surface of what you're doing is just stamping papers yes or no. And the game complicates this by giving that more meaning to that decision by attaching a face to it. So really, the individual one-on-one connection, once again, is a big part of why, of where that empathy comes from in this game. Lastly, here's Mortician's Tale, and I was actually really excited yesterday because somebody actually figured out this inspiration for the game on their own. As usually we have to explain that this was, and why this is a really powerful influence for us. But it's a really beautiful, insightful game that is about death. It's just, it frames itself as a death-positive game that shows the inner workings of an often overlooked industry, which, as you might imagine, is a lot similar to what we're trying to do. The subject matter of this game is going to unavoidably make some people uncomfortable, because it's not just about coming to terms with death, but you have to engage in the physical activity of processing bodies in a morgue. It does this in a way that is really melancholy and not too morbid, but you still are playing the role of a mortician and doing things that a mortician does. And its moment-to-moment intimacy is something that may be difficult, but it also makes it so great at showing its subject matter. And yeah, I really enjoyed the game, and also the art style in it made it feel a little bit less morbid at times, I guess. Alright, so that was a really quick look at some of the games that we looked at. So what did we learn from them, and how do they push boundaries, and what should we do, basically? So the first thing that comes to mind that I like to think about with these games, and I like to think about with our game, is something that I'm going to call distance. These games vary a bit in how much we as players, like what things players are directly exposed to and directly asked to do. Just to sort of visualize what I mean, I'm just gonna bark real loud. This is a good break. But just to sort of visualize what I mean with distance, I just drew a really quick scale about where I would put these in terms of how close the player is to the one-on-one interactions with what they're doing. So when I'm talking about distance, how graphic is it? How much does the player see and do? In Frostpunk, the player is like a godlike looking over everything overlord that sees everything. Even their criticisms of you doing these horrible things as a result don't seem to cut very deep, because it's your job to do whatever you have to in order for them to survive. But in Mortician's Tale, it's much, much closer. The player performs every step of every process and attends every funeral with every family of the people that they are engaged with. So this level of distance has a huge role, in my opinion, of creating the right balance of empathy for these games. How close the player is to the action totally changes the way they experience it. Another thing to consider is the sort of individuality of people, or in our case, dogs. And so how much personality is given to them to make them feel like something you should care about. And this is a section I think I'm going to skip over really quickly, as you can probably figure out sort of what I mean here. But again, in Frostpunk, there is not many focus on individuals, whereas in Mortician's Tale, there's a great deal focus on individuals, and it creates a totally different effect on sort of how it feels to play the game. Lastly, optimism is something that I think is really important for a game like this. One thing that all of these games surprisingly share is that they aren't doom and gloom all of the time. Frostpunk gets pretty close, but there's always something better to look forward to, even if it's far on the horizon. The message there isn't, though, that everything should work out or that everything should be happily ever after, but it is broadly valuable to have players walk away from your game with good feelings rather than bad ones. So in a game like this, there should be something for players to work towards, an optimistic resolution that is appropriate, feels rewarding, but also still reflects the themes of the game. And so Mortician's Tale is about death. However, it doesn't treat death like a dark thing, and it definitely ends on a high note. And this optimism can take lots of different forms, and it's something that like I said, I feel like it's really important. Okay, so what? I talked about a bunch of different games. Haven't talked about To the Rescue. But these inspirations are really important for sort of framing why our game is the way it is. So first, we really want to create that individuality that I mentioned. Dogs in the shelter, there's lots of opportunity for that individuality. So we're designing them so that they look different, they have unique traits, and subtle behavioral differences, some of which Joe talked about, that are getting a little bit more advanced. And I know that this UI is really, really old, so pardon for that. But it does still sort of show the sorts of things that make them unique. And all these traits are impactful rather than just being interesting and cute. They can also affect their livelihood of being adopted and really create empathy for individual dogs, that even ones that are, rated low or what have you. But it's also important for us to remember distance. Because we have euthanasia in the game, we don't want the experience to be so traumatic that, we push people too far and we make them uncomfortable. Especially when what we're trying to do is convey something really meaningful in that experience. So some of our early iterations of the game were very explicit, and too explicit in my opinion. But now, there's a level of separation to where, while you do still have to perform the action, it's not framed in a way that is gruesome or shocking. I think our art style also helps a lot with this, because the colorful, cartoony style really creates a barrier between the game and reality. It's also cute, and I know people really like the art, so, but I also feel like it has a purpose in this case of making these sort of things feel more approachable. The best part, though, is trying to fit in those optimistic moments, because with each of the dogs having their own personality, there are lots of moments for players to be really happy when things work out. So what we're really trying to do is make each adoption really feel like a victory. And on a broader scale, we're planning to work in narrative arcs that give a player a sense of accomplishment and progression as a sort of reward for enduring the really hard crunch moments. And if you play the demo, a lot of that isn't really reflected in the game right now, but we're really hoping to grow and expand those narrative elements. We want there to be both big and small victories, so no matter how rough it gets, there's always something to look forward to, or some small hope that things will get better. Okay, I'm going to take a breath and pay the dog tax. I know you heard him on stream earlier, but there's a picture of Keanu. But anyway, just in a quick summary, it's really okay for games to be painful and expressive when they need to be. But I also think it's great that some games are, or I do think it's great that some games are trying to push people's boundaries. But when trying to expose people to an idea and maybe create empathy for a situation, maybe we should stay within their comfort zones, which is what we're trying to do with To the Rescue. Okay, so I know I just talked nonstop for a while. Are there any questions that we've had pop up?
You've got one question that is there a way to avoid euthanasia if the dog is not sick or dangerous?
The way to avoid if they're not sick or dangerous? No, actually the player has to sort of make that decision on their own. So it is actually possible if you want to, you can euthanize any dog. However, euthanizing dogs affects your shelter's reputation, which is another thing we wanted to reflect in this game about sort of its ties to the real world. And that's if, a shelter is euthanizing lots of dogs that are fine and are likely to find homes, that really doesn't reflect well on the shelter, and that can have negative consequences down the line. So there are gameplay penalties for it, but it doesn't actively prevent people from doing that. And also, if you want to avoid euthanizing at all, there's an option to turn it off in the game right now, even in the demo, so that if that just makes you way too uncomfortable, you can push that separation even further apart.
And I think those are all the questions.
Oh, cool. Okay, well, because I probably went over time, I haven't even been checking the time. And I know I talked really fast, so.
One more question.
Oh.
Do potential adopters come in frequently enough that you have a high turnover rate for dogs?
In the demo, no. And really in the long term, we're going to be balancing it such that you typically will get more dogs than you get adoptions on average. But there will be other options for handling that space problem. You can expand as you gain more dogs, you can foster and things like that. And that way you're always growing and always having to reach different crisis points. So yeah, and it will be balanced a lot more equally in the long term. I know that if you play the demo, it probably does not seem that way, but that is our plan.
We've got a couple more, but we might be able to answer those in chat as we swap over.
Okay, sure. So yeah, thank you all for listening, and if you have any questions about this stuff from a developer or a player's perspective or anything like that, feel free to reach out anytime. And now I'm gonna go ahead and take the stream down for just a moment while we get everything set up for our last